Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CBT Dive. Today, we have a special guest. Her name is Megan Blair. She's a counselor who focuses on somatic experiencing. I'm really excited to take a back seat and not be the therapist in this session and see what I can learn from getting out of my mind and into my body. Hi, Megan.
Hey, Rahim.
How are you doing?
I'm doing super well. I'm super excited to be on this podcast with you.
I'm excited to have you. I was just reflecting on how we met the other day because people asked me if I made any friends while I was in Puerto Vallarta.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, I met one friend and her name is Megan and I met her at yoga.
Yes.
And she's a therapist. And now I know you don't always call yourself a therapist. You go by different titles, but I've been excited and interested in your work since we've met. So let's start off with, what kind of therapeutic practice do you do?
Sure. I mean, just like what you might say, it's always a holistic approach, right? But my training specifically is in somatic practices and mindful-based practices.
I like that. I like the language. I'm going to ask you to help me pick it apart a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of my listeners know what cognitive behavioral therapy is. And because of the state of social media, whether people realize it or not, they know what psychodynamic therapy is because they're often thinking about trauma responses and the unconscious and attachment. But you do somatic counseling, right? And so could you tell us what somatic counseling is?
Yeah. It's a umbrella term that is used in the field to describe body-based practices. And so, in looking at the mind-body connection, so they've kind of branched apart into different modalities. Like maybe some of your listeners know what somatic experiencing is, but some other ones by Peter Levine, he started that in the 1970s. But others might be internal family systems. Dick Schwartz started that. And also focusing, Eugene Gendlin started that. And it's kind of like they were all a lot of them were part of the same group. And so like one of them helped start the other, and there's a lot of crossover, and even what you're describing in looking at attachment styles is very much a part of a lot of these modalities as well. So I think the simple way to describe it is it places importance on the mind-body connection as the focus of intervention.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're focusing a lot on the body, and you use this term somatic experiencing. And it just stood out to me that you didn't say experience, like something in the past. It's something that's ongoing.
So I like to just really start with looking at the lay of the land for you. What does that feel like for you in your body? Because it's going to be different for everybody, right? What's important about this is that it is so, like a lot of modalities in psychotherapy, it's always client-led. It has to work for the client, for the individual.
Right. And when we talk about like the mind-body connection, why, like, is our premise that connection is poor to begin with? Or do we live in a world that makes that connection ruptured in some way? I'm trying to figure this part out.
No, that's a really good question. I think of a lot of our therapeutic modalities are talk therapy, right? We're always interested in the cognition and what's going on in our brains, but really there is so much knowledge that is constantly being taken in through the body, and more specifically the nervous system. And I've listened to your podcast, you've talked about the nervous system, so maybe some of your listeners have already been turned on to listening about the autonomic nervous system. But I feel like it's a just a different way of entry, and that's why we say both the mind and the body, because it's not either or.
Yes.
It's that connection between the two of them. And
Yeah.
what's really important about this field of study is that safety isn't something that we can realize through cognition. It's something that we need to feel in the body, right?
I see.
Yeah. So we're constantly taking in information from our environment, from inside of ourselves, through dynamics, through relationship. And so how can we start to tune into how we take in information through the nervous system?
Okay.
What do you think? Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of thinking about, if I were a client, how would I understand a session, or how would I know that I came to therapy and I did what I was supposed to, or that I had a good session? I'm trying to figure out with somatic work, like, do I leave a session feeling frustrated and then the therapist says, yeah, that's what being in your body is? Or do we spend, like, do I come in and talk about a problem, and then you might say, okay, hold on to that problem, and I'm going to redirect you to do a bunch of exercises that get you in your body, and then we approach that problem again. I'm trying to figure out how a session would look and how I might know that I'm, like, doing it. I'm doing it right. That feels
Mm-hmm.
important to me.
Mm-hmm. No, those are really good questions. And of course, like, you might be frustrated sometimes, you know what I mean? Like, we might hit that upper end of what feels comfortable, right? And I call those the pointy edges, and I think that there's the right level of hard work, that it's not going
Yeah.
into overwhelm like we talked about before, but we want to be challenged in our sessions. I know cognitive behavioral therapy focuses a lot on homework. I really love experiential sessions. So in the here and now, we're going to do this together if that feels right. So personally, if there was like a problem that a client might be bringing up in a session, I might bring it into an experiential. I call them experiments, and try this on.
Yeah.
Because also, if it doesn't work, if a client says, I hated this, that's good information too, So it's never on the binary of like, is this good? Is this bad? It's, was this useful to you, or why wasn't this useful to you? And it's all good information.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've got a good, you've got me thinking about this. And a follow-up for me then is about success from your perspective. So can you share maybe an anecdote or a story where you're working with somebody over one session or several sessions, and you see progress? I'm curious about how you understand the progress and what you would label as a success for that person, or how you would label it as a success together.
Yes. I can tell a story about a past client and how I measured that, how I saw that as success. I had a past client that had a few different ethnic identities and in former Yugoslavia, and they were at ends with each other. So there was some internal conflict that was happening. And we used a modality that's called focusing. And within this practice, it's a lot of cultivating what they call a self and presence, but it's just an objective perspective. Can we cultivate an objective perspective just to see what's going on in the body? So doing a body scan, seeing what's there, and then when something comes up, a part comes up that wants to be worked with, we can start to create dialogue with that part. We can start to see, is there patterns of other parts that light up? And we can also see what it wants from its perspective, what it doesn't want you to experience. So it's something that we worked on for a while together, and holding those different backgrounds within herself. And then last summer, she went back to her home countries and was able to travel there, felt resourced enough to go to these different countries. And also with the I guess, with the grace of knowing that hard things were going to come up, right? So the end goal of
Yeah.
this isn't that you're not going to have to write hard emails. You're not going to have to have hard conversations with your partner. It's that I feel like I know myself well enough to know what's too much and what are my tools when things get to be too much. And then really that measure of success for me is the flexibility of the nervous system. How can it come out of regulation and then come back into regulation? And she
Yeah.
felt resourced enough, and she felt that was supported enough to face some hard things. So I
Okay.
call that success in my mind, even though hard things happened, you know?
Of course.
Yeah.
I totally hear that. Thank you for that. So I just want to recap what I've heard you say. I've been taking some notes here. So some of the things you said in terms of somatic experiencing, um, you've kind of told us what some of the interventions and techniques are. So there's education, or what you would call psychoeducation, around the nervous system and the window
Mm-hmm.
of tolerance. So when you're feeling really activated or you're underactivated, either way, it's a response to being triggered and you're just not in your optimal zone.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've talked about awareness building. So you've educated people on the nervous system, and now it's their own kind of awareness of what is too much, what is hyper, and what is hypo aroused for me. And
Mm-hmm.
that's in their context relative to other events and settings. I really like the language you used around experiential work and doing experiments. And from what I gathered, experiments happen in the session and outside the session. And an example of experiments is parts work. Is that right?
You got it.
Okay. And parts work is something I know about through Gestalt, but it's similar to internal family systems. And I didn't realize it's part of somatic experiencing, but you've made that very clear because it's about doing something in the moment and then reflecting on what it feels like. The last thing that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting was you used this language of she felt resourced enough. And so I've heard this in passing from people that we're going to work on resourcing or internal resourcing. What is that? Can you expand on that language a bit? So what does it mean when a therapist says we're going to work on your resourcing or make you feel more resourced?
Yeah, and it's something that we've kind of mentioned before, is that internal sense of knowing is really important to
Ah,
that internal resourcing, right? So even resourcing might be practice with interrelationship focusing and being able to use that as a tool if feeling super activated, maybe just going internal into the body and saying what's here, and then seeing if a part is here that wants to be worked with, you know? And I think a
ah,
great thing about this is just holding the multiplicity that we all have instead of over identifying with, I am sad, I am mad. It's saying a part of me is sad. A part of me also might be joyful. A part of me also might be filled with grief. And so
I
it's just
like
really
that.
holding the multiplicity of all these different parts that we have. But as far going back
Yeah.
to your original question, kind of straying here, is that resourcing could be a lot of different things. But
Mm.
mostly, I think the key in this practice is cultivating an inner sense of knowing.
Okay. An inner sense of knowing. Um, if we were to do a little role play, would you be able to be my somatic counselor for a moment? Because I could use this right now.
Sure.
Would you be willing to try that? Okay. So
Cool.
I'll tell you really briefly what's going on in my life. Um, and that is just that I'm embarking on a lot of change. And I am someone who theoretically likes adventure and change, but the process is tough. It's anxiety inducing. There's a level of misery. I feel like there's not enough time. There's anxiety about the future. And I know
Mhm.
once I move to the next place, so I'm about to actually move to another city and state. And I know very well that like the adjustment time will be longer than what I anticipate because it always is.
Mhm.
And so I'm just throwing this at you, but I do wonder if you can if you've got an experiment for me or a way to help me know better my internal
Sure.
self.
I love this. And I love that you're curious and open and also willing to be vulnerable and just throw out what's happening for you now.
Yeah.
Do you feel comfortable like closing your eyes and going inward?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So I'm going to do a little bit of lead in. And so that is just going to just bring awareness to the body. And so I'll be doing that. So you're invited to close your eyes if you'd like. And starting to feel the edges of the body, what your feet are resting on, what your hands are resting on. Maybe feeling what you're sitting on, what your back is resting on. Just noticing you pressing against that area and that area pressing against you in that contact. And then starting to go a little bit more inward, starting with the head, asking yourself, how's the head doing today? Any sensations there? Or lack of sensation, that's also good information. Sometimes people see images or colors. There's no right way of doing this.
Mm.
And going down to your neck, tuning into your neck. How is your neck doing today? Down into your chest, tuning in here. And then tracing the line of awareness down into our left arm. And then going over to the other side and tracing the right arm. And coming back to the center and moving down to the stomach. Moving down into the pelvis. And then moving down into the left leg. And this is a big area, so making sure that you're taking your time, noticing any sensations in this area of your left leg. Then coming over to our right leg. And then lastly, let's see if we can just zoom out on a macro level and just taking in the whole body, maybe even around the body, and just asking ourselves, what's going on with our bodies today? And then bringing in that focus for today, the whole thing around all of the changes, all of the moving, and then just seeing how that lands in the body. And when something comes up, you might let me know.
You know, the two things that really came up, like I noticed when you asked me to breathe differently, or actually you asked me to move the scan from my right arm, then back to my chest and my stomach, I was
Mm,
suddenly breathing deeper.
mm,
And as soon as I breathed deeper, I thought to myself, oh my gosh, I'm so thirsty.
uh-huh.
And it made me think, have I not been aware that I've been thirsty for probably some time?
Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, let's keep going. We did the scan. And you said the leg is a big part. And I'm sitting cross-legged, so it's still the same size. It's still a big part, but it's overlapping another part. And I'm kind of all tucked in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I sit like that, not always. And so just being aware of it, I thought like, I'm really, I want to say like closed
Mm-hmm.
in some way, not feeling particularly open and like closed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And something's in you feeling closed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe we can kind of stick with that part
Mm,
of what would it be like just to close the eyes and go back in and really feel into that closed part there. Is there a certain place in the body, or is it just kind of, is there movement happening?
hmm. Well, I'm thinking like it's hard for me to feel the close part, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it.
Yeah, that's good awareness.
And the part of me that's closed is kind of like if I try to focus on it, an image comes up of like dragging something,
Mm-hmm.
like dragging a lot of dead weight.
Mm-hmm.
And it just makes like, makes me think about everything I have going on right now, where whether it's fun and social or it's work, productive, something, whether the deadline is past or something that I have lots of time to do, I'm just like closed. I'm dragging my feet. And this morning, yeah, I'm just like dragging it, dragging it. And this morning I
Yeah.
looked at my calendar and I just like emailed a bunch of people and canceled a bunch of things.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
just, everything feels heavy. And I think that's that closedness, the dragging is my state of being. I don't know what it's telling me, but um, I think I'm shutting down a bit.
Mm-hmm. In this moment, you feel yourself shutting down.
Um, yes, not with you specifically, but when I reflect on the change, yeah, I'm like shutting
Mm-hmm.
down.
Mm-hmm.
I want to cave into the closed part.
You want to cave into this closed part. There's a desire to want to go to this closed part.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I'm
Mm-hmm.
not seeing it as bad. I'm seeing it as like a barrier, not what I'm supposed to do, but I want to just listen to it and I want to just be horizontal on my couch endlessly. That's
Yeah.
just like what I want.
And and I'm not sure as far as recording, but maybe in a session we would experiment with that, right? We would say, what would it be like if now we went to and did horizontal? So that might
Mm.
be something to play with. But and checking in to make sure that that is the right description here. Is that something feels heavy and also something feels like it's dragging along and it's closed? And just feeling into that description, because also you have permission to change it or add to it, you know?
Ah, yeah. Um, I think I think I would keep it. I mean, it's similar to like dragging a suitcase uphill.
Mm-hmm.
but kind of thinking, like, I don't know what's in this thing. I just know that it's
Yeah.
heavy. Like, what is
Yeah.
in it even? Why am I
What's in
going
it
uphill? Who
even?
picked this route?
Yeah, that's interesting. It feels like a suitcase being dragged up a hill.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And and maybe we could just from that objective perspective, seeing if we can cultivate that sense of curiosity and
Mhm.
then feeling into this part that's heavy and dragging the suitcase up a hill.
Yeah.
And let's just see if we can give some voice and agency to this part. And also noticing when we start to blend with this part, it might be something that's pretty close right now, and it might be something that we want to start to identify with. And that's okay if that happens too. But being aware of that too. So feeling like we can maybe just give the mic over to this part that is
Mm.
heavy and dragging the suitcase up a hill and wants to close and wants to be horizontal.
Mm.
And what kind of company would this part want from you?
What kind of company? That's a great question. I think that part wants me to consult with them
Mm-hmm.
because that part is thinking, why am I doing this? I'm not sure it makes sense. I only want to
Mm-hmm.
do things that make sense. And that
This
part
part,
wants me to think like them and be less directive and instead consider
consider.
what I'm doing to that part.
Mm-hmm. So it has something to say.
It does.
Yeah.
It's
And maybe
protesting, in fact, I think.
it's protesting.
Mm.
What is it protesting here?
I think that part of me is saying, stop and like only make me work if it leads to something, if it makes sense.
Only leads to something and only makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how do you receive that message?
Uh, I think I feel like a bit called out or like a bit embarrassed because my scatteredness is being seen by another part of me.
Mm-hmm. A part's feeling a bit exposed here.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the decision making part of me is feeling exposed.
Yeah. So there's another part online I hear, that protesting part and that embarrassed, exposed part. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
couple different parts that are happening here.
Mm-hmm.
And also, maybe just really taking in what that heavy suitcase part has to say. It's saying it's protesting. And maybe just really letting that part know that you heard it or you understood it. Maybe that's what they need to hear back. Or no wonder they're feeling that way because of everything that's going on. Maybe see what it feels
Mm-hmm.
like for that part to feel heard.
Yes. I mean, I think through this process, that part feels more heard just because we've identified that they're a part.
Yeah.
But if I were to talk back to that part, I might say, okay, I hear you. I'm going to stop adding things to the calendar and making big plans or pulling us in different directions.
Hmm.
I'm going to sit with you and look at you and feel our joint energy to see what makes sense as the next step.
What makes sense is the next step. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how was that received?
I think the protest part is, I don't want to say happier now because it's like, it's tired, but I think more content
Hmm.
with the
Yeah.
prospect of like synergy and attunement.
Yeah. It's letting you know that that part of synergy is really what it's wanting. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Does that sound correct? It's a yes from this part.
Yes.
Yes. Good. And just seeing if more dialogue wants to happen here, or maybe this is a place of that it is complete for now. If there's anything else that wants to be said in this moment.
Mm. I think the protest part has like a lot more to say, but maybe it doesn't have to happen now. Like when I tune into that part, really, like it is mad. Like, you know,
It's
like I think it's saying, like it would say like we can do much more if we work together, but also you're misusing me. There's a limit to how much I can lift or drag or push.
it sounds like this part is worried about something. Does that sound right?
I think this part is worried about getting all used up and then being criticized for not being able to continue moving.
It's worried about being used up and being criticized about not moving.
Yeah. Because the
Yeah.
bigger part of me that makes all the decisions at the end of the day will say, like, I will say to myself, I guess even to this part, we didn't do enough today. We didn't do what we set out to do. It wasn't as organized or linear as it could have been. We're going to try again tomorrow. And so that sounds like positive, but it's a criticism.
That's great self awareness of knowing that criticism that's coming online too. It's part of criticism, it's part of protection, maybe in some ways.
Yeah.
Good
I think both
protective part.
parts, the protest part and the now embarrassed but decision making part, both know that a lot can be accomplished with like good alignment.
And maybe just taking a moment to really let them know that you hear that.
Yeah, the decision making part is saying, I hear that. You're totally right. Let's give ourselves time to sync up.
Let's give each other time to sync up.
Yeah.
And you might let these parts know that you can return to them. It sounds like that they are requesting more audience. And you might just want to let them know that this is a place that you can return to.
We'll be back.
We'll be back.
Thank
What
you for
did you
that.
think about that experience? I would love to hear from you as somebody that is, went into it for the first, I think it was your first time, right?
There is some similarity to work I've done in Gestalt,
Yes.
but I haven't done that in a while, and so I really enjoy that. It helps me slow down, and it's helping me, or it helped me, just connect with myself. Like I feel less scattered, a bit less fragmented.
Yes.
I will say it did feel like it's like a kind of emotional mental work to respond when you say, what does this part want to say to that part? Or is that part saying something? You know, like to me that was like, oh, this is, and I know it's meant to be work, but I just want to articulate that is not easy. It takes some focus.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that's why I also really like experiential in session things is
Yes.
that we can kind of, also I think a big part of it is hearing it back. Like, what was it like for you to say, like, oh, this part is protesting? What is it like to hear those things back and reflected to you? And it might be, that's not quite right. It's not really protesting. It's just going into collapse, actually. Or, like...
I think, like, from a somatic perspective, you bypass a lot of the jargon and the language and the memes and the TikToks, and we go to, like, hey, how does this feel? In this situation, in this context, with this person, when you think about this event, when you approach this time of year, how does it look, feel, sound, taste? How do you imagine it? And what meaning do you make of that? And so I'm really drawn to, like, the somatic way of being, particularly after this experience with you. For me, I'm always just a bit scared, I think, because you know that I do cognitive behavioral therapy and I do psychodynamic therapy, and Gestalt is a small part of my practice. And I think that's because I frankly have to be a bit less vulnerable when I do those modalities, both as a patient and as the therapist.
Right.
Whereas when I have to be in my body and really attuned, I'm more vulnerable. I'm doing a different kind of work. I'm exercising another a kind of muscle that I'm not that familiar with, frankly. And so that's tough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that, too.
Yeah.
Because I think as practitioners, we're always asking ourselves, how much do we put ourselves out there to clients? What's appropriate and what's too much, And I think that's a question that many, many, many practitioners have in all modalities.
Yeah.
Because as we all know, that client relationship leads to a lot of patient success as well, right?
Yes, totally.
And so also it's really important, but how do we do that? That's appropriate.
Yeah.
And that exists in somatics as well, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you so much, Megan, for being on the CBT Dive, talking to us about a bunch of stuff that's not CBT, which I think is super important, frankly, right? I think opening up to a multitude of modalities that help us get to know ourselves is really important. And I'm honored to have met you in this way, because you're like adding to my knowledge, So thank you.
You as well. It's a great podcast, and I'm like really happy to be here on this podcast and also with you.
Yeah, take care. We hope you enjoyed that experience. I certainly did. Thank you again to Megan Blair, our special guest for today. If you're interested in somatic counseling and some of Megan's work, you can find her on Instagram or Google Megan Blair. Thank you for joining us at the CBT Dive, and we hope to see you again.